Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. Very short Mishnah, very short Gemara, but this is going to get into a deep point about a dispute between the Tanaim, and it's on Breira, which is this retroactive designation. Now, the Mishnah and the Gemara is basically going to set up for these sorts of before something happens, after something happens cases. And then it's going to get into the big one right at the end. And we're going to look at the Vilna Gaon for some help on how to understand what's going on with this. So the Mishnah starts off and it says that a Gentile, a non-Jew, who reaped his field and then he converted to Judaism before the sheaves were removed to the main pile, is exempt from lechet, shichechas, and peah. So what's happening here is that, let's say you're cutting all the produce in the field to make small sheaves all over the field, and later you want to remove all the sheaves to make a big pile. So the Mishnah is dealing with a case of a not Jewish farmer who became a convert after cutting down his field's produce, but before moving the sheaves to the main pile. So the question is now that he continues like the collection process as a Jew, and that's going to arise this question with regards to his liability with regards to the various gifts of the poor. In other words, when he first started to cut it, he was not Jewish. He made these small bundles, and then he converted, and then he takes the small bundles and he starts to pile them all together. What does he owe anything? What's going on with that? And hey, it says in the Torah you're supposed to leave it from your standing sheaves at the end. Well, he's already cut it down and then he converted. So what's going to be with this? Don't forget that the lechet, which are the gleanings that are the stalks that slip from the farmer's hand and fall on the ground as he's reaping the produce, ordinarily those are left to the poor. We know that in Leviticus 19:9. The shichechas are the forgettings, and that has two different categories. You have the shichechas of standing grain, and that is going to be the standing grain that the farmer overlooks when reaping, and ordinarily he's not allowed to return and cut it. He has to leave it to the poor. And then you have the shichechas of the sheaves, and that has to be left to the poor. And that's where the sheaves of the produce are forgotten in the field during the process of gathering the smaller sheaves into the main pile. And ordinarily, these may not be retrieved, but they have to be left to the poor. We know that from Devarim, chapter 24, line 19, pasuk 19. So the Tana rules that since the convert reaped the produce while he was not Jewish, he is exempt from lechet, shichechas, and peah. But now that he's Jewish, he does not have to separate any peah from the crop, and he may retrieve his lechet and shichechas. And this refers to the shichechas of the standing. Of the sheaves. So even the not just the one that is standing, but even the sheaves. And the reason he's exempt from lechet and peah is that the Torah in Leviticus 19:9 is going to emphasize that the obligation applies when you reap the harvest of your land. And since the reaping occurred while he was still a non-Jew, there's no obligation. And a similar verse in Devarim 24:19 is written regarding the shichechas of standing grain, which is forgotten while reaping. And with respect to the shichechas of sheaves, which are forgotten after the reaping, when the sheaves are removed to the main pile, no such verse is written. But the Tana exempts the convert nonetheless, and the Gemara is going to get into the reason. Now, Rabbi Yehuda here is going to bring up some interesting topics. The Mishnah continues, and it says, Rabbi Yehuda obligates him in shichechas, because the shichechas obligation takes effect only at the time the sheaves are removed to the main pile, at which point he's already a Jew. So Rabbi Yehuda and the Tana Kama, they agree that the convert is exempt from the obligations of Lechet and Peah, since these are taking effect when the guy starts reaping. And when he started reaping, he was a non-Jew. And in the same way, he agrees that also the convert is exempt from the obligation of the standing Shichechas, because that obligation also took effect with the reaping, at which point he was a non-Jew. The only dispute here that Rabbi Yehuda has with the Tana Kama is about these sheaves that have already been bundled up. And Rabbi Yehuda's view, since the obligation takes effect only when the sheaves are forgotten during removal to the main pile, and by this time the owner already converted to Judaism, he is obligated to leave those sheaves to the poor. So the Gemara is going to clarify the Tana Kama's opinion, and the sugya reads like this. It says, Rabbi Yehuda spoke well. He presented a valid argument. What is the rabbi's reason for exempting the convert from the shkicha obligation that takes effect after his conversion? And the Gemara answers, and it reads, Rabbi Yossi, in the name of Rabbi Hiskiah, and Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, it is written with respect to the shkicha obligation, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forgot a sheaf in the field. So this is talking about when you're reaping the harvest of your field and you forgot the sheaf in the field. And there's two forms of shkicha that are alluded to in this verse. Basically, we have these two kinds. We have the one that's left standing, the shkicha that's left standing. The farmer is harvesting, and he turns behind him and he sees some stalks behind him, and they're standing there. He can't go back and cut them. They have to be left standing. And that doesn't count as peah. You can't stick that standing grain behind you into the peah obligation of 1/60th. That has its own designation. That's shkicha. You can't turn it into anything else. And then you have the one of the forgotten sheaf, where you've already started making these little bundles of the cut grain, and you forgot one. You piled up all the others, and there's one that you left behind. That's left for the poor. That's a gift to the poor. So that, by the way, also cannot be turned into peah. You can't say, oh, well, I'm going to stick this over into the 1/60th and make that also part of peah. No, it has its own distinction. And note that there's this like wall here where there's not even a suggestion that they can take this and turn it into peah, right? That's just, it's like you forgot it. That's a specific rule in the Torah. It's written, and that has its own classification that you can't change it. And we know that from the Torah. So we have these two types of shkicha, and so Rabbi Yossi is saying that it's written with regards to this, and here's how the sugya continues. It says, when the verse states, and you forgot a sheaf, this is a reference to the shkicha of a sheaf. And when it states in the field, this is a reference to the shkicha of standing grain. And the juxtaposition of these two obligations constitutes a hekesh, which teaches that the obligations are linked. So the beginning of the verse already stated that when you reap the harvest of in your field, that's in the Torah. And it's obvious that the sheaf is forgotten in the field. So why does the Torah repeat, and you forgot a sheaf in your field? And this extra phrase is there so that the shkicha obligation that is not explicit in the verse, which is that you have the standing grain and then you have the one that was already cut. So the Rosh Cirillo explains that due to this redundancy, this word "and you forgot" written in the Torah explains that explains that applying the word sheaf, omer, sheaf, as well as the word besedech, in the field, uh, as though the Torah had written, and you forgot a sheaf and you forgot in the field. In other words, forgetting in the field is going to be alluding to the standing grain, which is attached to the field. That's the comment by the Rosh Cirillo. And it's worthy to note that this explanation by the Yerushalmi you can also find in Rabbi Yuda's view in Bavli, Sota 45a, and the sages there derived the law of shichechas from that standing from the beginning of the verse. So again, you have a thing where the Torah is written in a certain way, and you have in your field, and then it says in the field, and because of that, they're creating this hekesh between these two kinds of shichechas, where one is standing and one is a sheaf that's already been tied and forgotten in the field. So this juxtaposition is going to teach the obligations are linked as follows, and the sugya reads: that which is subject to the shichechah of standing grain is subject to the shichechah of sheaves, and that which is not subject to the shichechah of standing grain is not subject to the shichechah of sheaves. So just to explain this real quick, from an explanation from the Mara Fulda, he's saying that since the Mishnah's case, the produce was not subject to the shichechah of standing grain because the owner was a non-Jew at the time of reaping when the obligation took effect. It is also excluded from the shichechah of sheaves, even though the owner had converted by the time the obligation was to take effect. So let me explain this from the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon writes like this. He says, it emerges that both the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda agree that the convert is exempt from the obligation of the standing grain shichechah, since the obligation takes effect with the reaping, at which point he was a non-Jew. The dispute is only with respect to the shichechah of sheaves. And Rabbi Yehuda obligates the convert in this form of shichechah since he is Jewish at the time the obligation takes effect. When the sheaves are forgotten during removal of the main pile, the Tanakama, however, exempt him even from this form of shichechah due to the linkage between the two forms of shichechah written in the Torah. And the Minchas Chinuch in chapter 592, Safe 10, says that it is questionable whether rabbis would say the same thing regarding a field owned by a minor who reached maturity between the reaping and the gathering of the sheaves. Possibly they would say that since the field was not subject to the shichechah of standing grain, since the owner was a minor during reaping, it is also excluded from the shichechah of sheaves. Or perhaps the rabbis would apply this reasoning only when the owner was a non-Jew and completely excluded from the law of shichechah at the time of reaping. So there's another way to look at this for why Rabbi Yehuda argues and does not equate the shichechah omer and the shichechah kama, in other words, the standing and the sheaves. And we know that a hekesh can equate two laws only when the laws are stated explicitly in the Torah. And since the obligation of the shichechah kama is merely implied from a redundancy from the word field, a hekesh cannot be applied to equate it with the law of shichechah omer, the standing shichechah, which is explicit in the Torah. So one may not apply some sort of exegetical principle of hekesh at will and it's only going to be in cases where they received a tradition to that effect. And the Rashi in Sukkah 31a is pointing out that Rabbi Yudah did not receive a tradition from his teachers linking the Shchicha Omer and Shchicha Kama, and therefore does not subscribe to it. Also worth looking at is the Tosefta in chapter 2:9 of Peah. So the Gemara is going to cite a brisa related to this Mishnah's ruling that the produce grown by a Gentile is exempt from lechet, shchicha, and pay obligations. It was taught in a brisa, if a Jew and a Gentile were business partners in a field of standing grain, the Jew's share is subject to Peah and the Gentile's share is exempt. Now, we talked about business partnerships before, and that was in chapter 3. And that was talking about, well, if two people inherit a field, and then what happens if, obviously they're both Jewish because they inherited it together, right? So they're both Jewish. Or what's happening where, one person sold it to another person, or they inherited it and then decided to split the property. They co-owned the property and then they split it. But what has not been talked about yet has been when a non-Jew and a Jew are partners. What's going to happen with the gleanings then? What do? Because you have a lot of issues. It says in the Torah, it says your field. Your field is always going to be talking about for people that are Jewish, but inside of there, it might be half owned by a non-Jew. So you might be excluded altogether. And this is where we're going to get into this whole concept of Breira and really see that this is a sub-theme on this entire halacha. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in Seif 87 in his Burim, he has the following insight about this. He's saying that if the partners were partners in the entire field and they reaped the field before dividing the produce between themselves, as such, there arises the question of the Jew's liability in regard to the obligation of Peah. Had they divided the produce while it was still uncut, there would be no question as to the Jew's obligation of the Peah, since at the time of the cutting, when the Peah obligation takes effect, it had already been separated. But what's going to happen if, what's going to happen if they didn't divide the produce while it was uncut and they just decided to cut it? Now you're going to have a question, because inside of this cut produce you have produce owned by a Jew and a non-Jew mixed together, and presumably you're going to have Peah mixed in there somehow. So one of the comments here by the Pnei Moshe is that when reaping the field, 1/120th of the entire crop, which reflects 1/60th of the Jew's 50% share of the crop, should be left uncut and designated as Peah, and accordingly the Jew receives 1/60th less than 50% of the harvest, whereas the non-Jew receives his entire 50% share of the harvest. And similarly, half the gleanings and forgotten sheaves of the stalks must be left to the poor, and half are taken and kept by the non-Jewish partner. So the crux of the matter is gonna really get into it when we look at the Rabbi Shimon's view in Toras Kohanim. So here's what Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says about this. He says, in the ruling set forth, obligating the Jew in Peah from his share is not representative of the view of all Tanaim. In fact, the Tosefta cites Rabbi Yishmael's dissenting opinion that the Peah obligation is applicable only when the field is completely owned by Jews. If a non-Jew had a share in the field, the Peah obligation is not applicable at all. And this is the view of Rabbi Shimon in Toras Kohanim, Kodashim, chapter 1, Halacha 11. And this is mentioned also by the Amora Rava in Bavli Chulin 135b. So a lot of these people do not hold by Breira. So then what? I know that Rava does not hold by Breira, and then you have a whole bunch of issues. Well, who what do you do with this? Um, the This view is going to be based on the verse of Leviticus 19:9, where it says, "You shall not finish off the corner of your field, and you shall not gather the gleanings of your harvest." And the word "your" is going to be taken by people like Rava and Rabbi Yishmael to say that the word "your" is taken to mean that the obligations apply only when the field is solely your field, being a Jewish-owned field, but not if a non-Jew has a share in it. Um, the the view on these sorts of issues, Rabbi Shimon holds that these sorts of partnerships, um, you just split it, and the Jew still has to own it. Rabbi Yishmael, when it comes to harvesting produce and shvius and things like that, and also Rava, they hold that no, and actually hold much more strictly that that it has to be owned by you. Also, that's Rabbi Meir's view as well, and they're just more makpid on it. So the Vilna Gaon is going to give some explanations of this dispute, um, and going to help us to understand this. So, according to this explanation, the dispute between the Breira and the dissenting opinion mentioned by Rabbi Hizkiah is whether the Jew's share in a field owned by a non-Jew is subject to Peah. And the Vilna Gaon writes that Rabbi Hizkiah concurs with the Breira that the Jew's share is subject to Peah. The dispute is whether the produce left by the Jew for the poor is completely Peah, and accordingly exempt from Trumas and Meiser. Perhaps, since the produce was jointly owned by a Jew and non-Jew, the produce left as Peah is in reality Peah and non-Peah mixed together, and accordingly half of the produce left as Peah is obligated in Trumas and Meiser. And this question hinges on the principle of Breira, this idea, by the way, of this retroactive clarification. In other words, you're defining it after the fact. And that's really the subject between, the dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Gamliel that is going to be over there in Hulin, or also in Bavli and Gittin 47b. We know that argument also comes up in Demai chapter 6. The Breira cited in the Gemara, says the Vilna Gaon, describes the principle of Breira. And according to this principle, when the partners in a field divide the season's crop, their distribution of shares clarifies retroactively the portion that stood to be the share of each partner from the moment it grew. So in our case, the produce taken by the Jewish partner as his share of the crop was entirely his all along. That is, it was grown and harvested as Jewish produce. And accordingly, the Peah left from his share is entirely Peah, and therefore exempt from Trumas and Meiser. But the Vilna Gaon continues. He says, Rabbi Hizkiah comments that the Breira's position in this matter reflects the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and is disputed by Rebbe. And according to Rebbe, who does not subscribe to the principle of Breira, when the partners divide the produce between themselves, each partner does not receive that which was his all along. Rather, what he now receives was originally half his and half his partner's, and accordingly, each ear left for Peah is in reality half Peah and half his partner's, and accordingly, each ear left for Peah is in reality half Peah and half non-Peah, since half of each ear belonged to a non-Jew at the time of reaping, and when the Peah obligation takes effect, and is going to therefore be subject to Trumas and Meiser. Um, what a deep insight by the Vilna Gaon to help us to explain this and to get a better idea of this. So it's a big deal. I mean, if this is a debate Tanayim. If there's no Breira, then guess what? The poor have to take half of what they think is Peah, and they're obligated to Truma and Meiser on it. And if there is Breira, um, he can take all the Peah and not worry about it. So that's a very big question, and um, we'll find out the the true understanding of whether there's Breira or not Breira when Eliyahu Navi comes to clarify all this stuff. But you could see where it would be a big deal because guess what? Half of what the farmer would be leaving as Peah might actually be obligated with Trumas and Meiser, according to this deep insight by the Vilna Gaon. So anyway, we have to really be careful about really studying halacha and really learning because there's so much subtlety and there's so much depth here. And that's why it says, turn it over, turn it over, turn it over. It's all here. And, we just, as Jews, have to really get back to really learning halacha and really trying to understand it as the basis because we have an obligation in the Torah to guard these ordinances. And we have to, part of guarding it is to learn and so that we can understand it because as you can see from this case, if there's no Breira, the Jew who thinks he's taking charity might actually be eating Kodesh. So it's a big deal. And the only way to know about it is to learn. So I encourage you to really focus on your learning and have a great day.